Hey, thanks for checking out this podcast. Our hope is that it's an encouragement to you, that it builds your faith, that it helps you be a better leader and a better influencer in and through your life. If this is helpful to you, we'd love you to subscribe and also share it with somebody else to encourage them too. Thanks.
All right, everyone, welcome to the VC Podcast. Today we are in part 2 of sharing your testimony. We're talking all about how we can kind of help you and equip you to tell your story, to share your testimony.
Yeah, so we want to give you some practical tips on ways to tell your testimony, how to sort of think through the arc of the story of Jesus' work in your life.
Right, exactly.
Great.
So I'll do a quick practical bit here.
Okay.
I can tell you my testimony in under 30 seconds.
Yeah.
I was 14, I was lost, I had nothing going for me, but I got invited to youth group, I met Jesus, it changed my life, and now I have so much joy in my life.
That's awesome.
That's my testimony.
Yeah, and that's so good to hear. And you know what's cool about it? I can't argue with you.
Nope.
Because that's just your story. There's nothing to say back other than, wow, cool. Yep.
So here's the deal. If you were to ask me when I was like 16, tell your testimony, I'd be like, I can't do that.
Right.
That's too long. That's too much.
Right.
That's intimidating. What do you?
Sure.
How am I going to be able to write all that down? But this simple system, this simple list, really helped me. Who were you before Jesus? How did you meet him? How's it been since?
Right.
That's it. 3 parts.
So there's a before and after.
Yeah.
And then there's something
There's
that
that
happened
moment
in the middle. Right.
Yeah.
And that's as simple as it is.
Yeah.
Any story.
Yeah.
Right. There's a before, there's an after, and there's something that takes place.
So quickly, what's your testimony in the similar like short form? What's your testimony?
So I grew up in this wonderful Christian home, but as I got a little older, into my teen years, I experienced a kind of emptiness and lostness and brokenness within, and realized that something was missing for me. And after a kind of a long, slow slide, I eventually hit bottom and cried out to God and just said, God, if you're real, I want to know you. And it was in that I met Jesus, and not in some sort of spooky supernatural way, but just in a very genuine, real way. I met Jesus, and there was I was 15 years old when it happened, so not that different than you. And just from that moment forward, I just thought, this is what my heart has longed for. This is what that emptiness was speaking to.
Wow.
And I've just always, since that day, like that was, 30 some years ago, I've just wanted everybody to know Jesus satisfies. Jesus is life. Jesus is living water. So that's my journey in a
really
very
small nutshell.
Small nutshell. And then, of course, when I say all of that, just like you, I can think of so much
hundreds of other things
that goes with that. So if I have 3 minutes, I can tell a 3-minute version. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you can start to expand on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think of the same thing. Like we were told, like you need to be able to share your testimony in a passing conversation.
Right.
Someone would call it like an elevator pitch.
Right.
By the time you get to the bottom of an elevator, can you tell your story?
Yeah.
And I was actually preparing. The reason I know that is because I was preparing to go on a mission trip when I was 16.
Right.
And one of the prerequisites for going on a mission trip was you had to write down your testimony on this piece of paper. It was like the boot camp before the mission trip. And I remember being so daunted. It was daunting. Like I was scared. But I thought, I don't have a testimony. There's no way.
Right.
Because at 16, here's what I want to tell you is I didn't know my story at 16.
Right.
It took someone sitting me down with a piece of paper and saying, tell your story, for me to actually critically look back and ask myself, where did God show up in my life?
Yeah.
So if you were to ask me on the spot, I'd say, I don't really know.
I don't know.
I don't know. But here's my initial observation is, I used to be somewhere else and I'm not there anymore.
Right.
But I can point to a time where I definitely did not know Jesus.
Right.
Somewhere between there and here, I'm not the same.
Right.
And then I started filling in the gaps. So what happened? Well, I know that there was a really powerful moment on the side of a river for me, where I was like, that was it. Like I wanted to follow Jesus at that moment.
Yeah.
And then I think of the months after. I'm still fumbling, but I tell you what, I had a glimpse of a hope that I didn't have before. And I just kept walking and I kept growing. And 10 years later, I could fill in the rest of the gaps of how God shows up in my life. But it started because I had to get into the habit of looking back and asking myself, what happened? How did I get here? Because I'm not where I was.
As we think through that before, what happened, and after, do we have any tips for people on each one of those? Like maybe let's talk a little bit about the before piece.
Right.
So what would we tell people about their before story?
So here's a big important caution.
Okay.
Your goal is not to bring glory to pain.
Right.
So if you had a very ugly past, don't give so many details where that becomes the thing they walk away with.
Right. So sometimes we can almost over dramatize the past.
Right.
It was really, really, really bad. And we can maybe not exaggerate, but just glorify. Yeah.
Draw too much attention.
Draw too much attention to how bad it was.
Right. But here's the thing. Like, obviously, here's what you want to do. You want to make sure that you, honestly and authentically talk about how far God has taken you from there.
Yeah, where you were at, and like my journey, it was bad. Like when I think back to my pre-Christ days, there's some pretty awful, pretty broken, and so I do want to give expression to that. I don't want to lie or gloss over it.
Right.
But at the same time, I don't want to over.
Right. Right. And here's a beautiful thing. Here's a tip. Typically, when you're talking about your past, I think the first instinct is you want to talk about behavior.
Sure.
You want to almost talk about, here are all the stupid things I did.
Right.
And I did a whole lot of stupid things. But when I tell my story, that I've told my story a lot, I almost always draw attention to the heart condition.
Right.
My heart was broken. Like, I was lost.
Right.
And I did things that hurt people.
Sure.
But God met me, and this is where I went from here.
Yeah.
It's not about the behavior, it's about the heart condition.
Right.
If I were to track behaviors, like, sure, I could tell you a story about how I used to do stupid stuff, now I do less stupid stuff, now I'm here. Yeah. But that's not where the main story is. The main story is just below the surface.
Right.
Is my heart was broken and I was lost and I didn't have identity.
Right.
God met me and I found purpose.
Right.
And now here's where I've gone
now
since then.
This is really key because this is going to be true in all three of these.
Yes.
So your pre-story, your after, and then what happened. All three of those. You're looking for, as you think through those and as you talk about them, you're looking for themes.
Right.
So you just talked about identity.
Yep.
You talked about purpose.
Yep.
Those were themes that came up for you.
Yep.
They were missing. Then in your encounter, they were discovered. And then afterwards, now that's part of your journey of finding those things in Jesus, right? So everybody's is going to be a little bit different. For some, it's this overwhelming sense of sinfulness.
Right.
For others, it's this overwhelming sense of brokenness or meaninglessness or emptiness or pain or, there's different things that are part of that past that will be your themes. And you might even have different versions of your own testimony depending on just how you feel to share your story at any given time.
Right, because all of those threads are true. It's just a matter of which thing do you want to draw attention to.
Right.
In this moment. So, there's a bunch of themes of things that God showed up with me with, and identity is the one I usually go to because it was the one that was most apparent.
Yep.
But there are all kinds of different ways that God showed up for me.
Yep.
So when we're talking about before, don't over draw attention to the sin behaviors.
Sure.
Draw attention to the heart condition that you were at. Like, were you broken? Like, what was going on in your life? And you could talk about what happened, but maybe just reference them. Like, don't go into detail and paint the picture. If there's a picture you want to paint the picture of Jesus.
Now, one more thing there. Some people don't really have anything negative to say.
Right.
Because just things were so good in their journey up. They grew up in great environments and so on. One of the ways that you can reflect on that is, where would you be without Jesus?
Yeah.
So you can think, I grew up with these great things that happened to me through my family or through other people's connections or through Jesus himself at 3 years old, but I can't imagine where I'd be today if it wasn't for what Jesus has done. So that's another way to kind of reflect into that pre-section.
Totally.
Should we give some tips on the moment or the...
So here's this gets a little fuzzy too.
Yep.
Some people's moment, quote unquote, isn't literally a moment.
Right.
It might have happened over the course of time.
Sure.
But, talking about the first few steps of Jesus showing up for you where you're like, this makes sense, I get it, when it became real to you.
Yep.
Here's what you're not looking for. A, if there isn't this big firework moment, don't make one up.
Right.
And don't feel bad if you don't have one.
Right.
You just tell the story. So if it was little moments over the course of a bunch of years, like if you accepted Jesus when you were 3, and what you found is that when you were at 14, something started clicking and it started making sense, and you're like, wow, this is important to me. I love this.
Right.
That's as powerful a story. Tell that story.
Absolutely.
And
that's your encounter.
That's your moment.
Like from 3 and 14, and you just describe it that way.
Yeah.
And we could probably come up with a whole bunch of those, right?
Yeah.
One person might say, you know what? It was somewhere in my, between the ages of 17 and 20. Where it became real for me, just in those years.
Right.
And then another person will say, you know what? I was part of a Bible study where we studied the book of Romans, and I don't know which week it was, but as we were studying it, I grasped faith, and it was in that Bible study. And another person will have a very dramatic moment where it's like, I was at the such and such meeting, I walked to the front and knelt down, and that was, so it's going to look different for everybody.
Right.
And some it's drawn out. In my own case, I have 2, right? Like when I was 6 years old, I asked my mom, what's a Christian?
Right.
And she said, well, it's a person who's received God's grace, given in the cross, forgiven of their sins. And then I was like, oh, okay, thanks. And she said, do you want to become one? And I was like, well, yeah. And I could tell more to that story because that was my 6-year-old experience.
Yeah.
Now, as I got older, I didn't really embrace that faith in a personal way in my early teen years.
Right.
And so my faith was more my parents' faith and something I had prayed at 6 years old.
Right.
And so when I was 15, I had like a salvation experience where I turned my life over to God and He saved my soul. And I could tell that whole journey. So, was I saved at 6 or was I saved at 15? I don't know. I encountered Jesus and I can tell the stories of those things. And rather than trying to make a theological statement, I'm sharing my journey. And, sometimes when I share my testimony, sometimes I'll share both of those encounters. Sometimes I'll just share one of them.
Right.
Right.
So, the before, the moment, or the where Jesus met you part, the contact point.
Yep. Can I just say another thing about that contact point? Generally speaking, I would say, and not always, but generally, leave your weird God stories for a different time. Right. So we all have weird God stories, non-Christians and Christians alike. We have moments where it's kind of spooky encounters. Sure. And it's not that we shouldn't share those. We should share them. But just be careful, again, of the over-dramatization. Right. Because it can kind of freak people out or scare people or weird people out. Sure. So know your audience, like who are you sharing this with? And just think about how much do I, you don't want to be like, I woke up and I looked at the clock and it was 3:13. And, 3:13 in the Bible was this and this. And, sometimes we can over-dramatize some of those spiritual moments. And sometimes we can under-dramatize them too and sort of just wash over.
We want to be aware of who we're talking to.
Yeah.
And usually, anyways.
Yeah, how it will come across.
You said it well. Yeah.
And do it authentically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally.
Sorry. So I just wanted to bring that piece into.
Yeah, that's super
because
good.
sometimes we think our witness is telling our weird God stories, and not that those are bad or wrong. No, we all have.
There's a time
some
and a place for them.
Totally.
It may not be first conversation stuff.
Right. Yeah. That's a good way to say it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So after here's what's beautiful. This part, two things could happen. One. You could say, well, I'm still terrible or something. Like you can be too self-deprecating in the after part where it's like, I was an idiot then, and I'm still an idiot. Well, hold on. Talk about the progress.
Right. What
Focus
has God
on the
done?
progress.
Yep.
Yep. Or we can say, well, now I'm rich, or now I've got all these
Yeah,
material
now my life
things.
is perfect.
Yeah, well, neither are great.
Yeah.
What you want to do is give an honest, like, here's how God has taken me,
Right.
and here's how that hope has shifted my heart.
Yeah.
Again, you want to focus on those heart things, and you can mention how your behavior's wildly shifted as well,
Sure.
but really make the focus on how God has healed your heart and how God has shown up for you.
Yeah, so often that sounds something like, you know what, my life isn't perfect now.
Yeah.
And I don't do everything perfect. But boy, do I have a hope that I never had before.
Yeah, I'm not where I used to be.
Or an identity.
Yeah.
Or this or that. Or do I ever know the forgiveness of God, and has that ever brought me life? Or now my life has purpose. So, yeah, so there's this balance of, I'm not trying to say Jesus has suddenly made all my problems go away.
Right, because that's not usually the case. Yeah.
At least I don't know anybody who that's the case for.
I don't know anybody who that's the case for. Yeah. And, okay, all this being said, right, I want to talk to you about kind of, well, I want you to know that your story matters. We talked about this last week.
Yeah.
Even if you don't think it was very eventful.
Right.
I want to compare two characters real quick.
Yeah,
I'm not going to
great.
spend too much time on this.
I love this.
But there's a character, woman at the well. We talked about her last week.
Yeah.
She had this moment where Jesus met her at the well. It's this very dramatic moment where she's ashamed and she doesn't want to be around people, but Jesus meets her and offers her living water and a hope. And she meets him and is changed, and she runs out into the town telling everyone about Jesus. There was like a moment, boom, and then she's different. There's transformation right away. Not all of us have that exact experience.
Right.
I want to talk to you about another character, Nicodemus. The chapter right before, not as many people talk about his story. They might talk about a verse or two that Jesus said to him, but his story is this. Jesus met him in the middle of the night. He was a Pharisee.
Yep.
Met him in the middle of the night, and Jesus gives him this hard conversation. He tells him you have to be born again.
Right.
And he's confused. He's like, what do you mean be born again? And then Jesus tells him, he's like, yeah, this is it. And there's no follow-up sentence after. So Jesus just left. He went off to the next place. But there's a couple verses that give us clues as to what happened to Nicodemus. In the middle of John, it says that Nicodemus was in a room full of other Jewish leaders.
Yeah.
They were talking about killing Jesus.
Yeah.
Now, let me tell you one thing. We know that Nicodemus didn't just get up and start following Jesus in chapter 3.
Right.
Because in chapter, I think it's 7, he's here.
Yeah.
He's still in the room.
Yeah, yeah.
But in the third chapter, he wasn't even willing to be seen with Jesus.
Right.
He met him at night because
Meets
he
him
didn't
in
want
the
to be seen with
night.
him.
He's kind of hiding out.
But here he says, "What are you guys talking about? We cannot kill Jesus without a trial. Like, you can't just kill a man."
Right. So he sort of stands up for Jesus.
He stands up for Jesus.
Yeah.
In that moment, but he's still in the room.
Right.
he's like, come on, guys, you can't do. He's hesitant.
Yeah.
You know, he's not quite standing up
Yeah, he
for
doesn't
Jesus.
quite say Jesus is the Christ.
Yeah, no,
You know?
but there's some difference. There's a little change.
Yeah.
And then finally, this is one of the most beautiful moments in the Bible for me.
Yeah.
It's at the end.
Yeah.
Jesus is killed.
Yeah.
And he's freshly killed. And someone asks, can we bury the body? His name's Joseph.
Yeah.
He asks him, can we bury the body? Well, John tells us something about Joseph. Joseph's only characteristic that we know is this random guy.
Yeah.
He was a secret disciple because he was afraid of Jewish leaders.
Right.
And it says, here's who came with him to bury the body of Jesus. Nicodemus is or was a Jewish leader.
Yeah.
And Nicodemus brought all these expensive things to the graveside.
Yeah.
On what I believe is the hardest day to have followed Jesus is probably the day he was in the dirt.
That was a risky move.
Yeah, in front of his colleagues who just killed him.
Yeah.
With a man who didn't want to be seen with him. I'll tell you what.
So now we have a full-fledged stand for Christ.
He's standing. He's standing for Jesus.
Yeah.
He is at the graveside.
Yeah.
He is standing publicly for the Messiah. And here's what's beautiful. The narrative does not tell us. Here's the moment where Nicodemus found faith. We don't know where it happened.
Right.
But we know something changed.
Right.
He's not where he was.
Yeah.
And that's a testimony.
Yeah, you know, I love that.
Yeah.
And so there's both.
Yeah,
There's the woman
both.
at the well, and there's the Nicodemus, and there's probably everything in between.
Yeah,
And
a collection of small moments
Sure.
where you look back and you ask yourself, am I where I was?
Yeah.
No. Well, then God did something.
Yeah.
Let's get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, I heard somebody say it this way once. They said, I don't know when it happened, but if you were to ask me a year ago if I was going to heaven, I would have just say, I don't know, I hope so.
Yeah.
And if you were to ask me today, I would say absolutely yes, because of the grace of God in Christ, right?
Wow.
And so I don't know when along the way that changed for me,
Right.
but somewhere along the way, I
Right.
found out it's the grace of God in Christ that saves my soul, and I
Exactly.
found redemption.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every story is important. Everyone needs to tell their story.
Tell your story.
Whether-
Let the redeemed of the Lord say so.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Psalm 100 and something.
That's good. Yeah, and so remember that structure: before, and the middle, and then after. So before, then where you met Jesus, and then after you met Jesus, where have you been? Was it worth it?
Right.
And remember that you should not be ashamed of your story.
Yeah.
Whether you think it's too messy or too insignificant, your story matters, and someone needs it.
Amen.
Someone like you needs it. And so, our challenge to you this week, in the next 2 weeks, tell your
tell
story.
your story.
Tell your story to someone.
It's good.
All right.
Thank
you
you.
guys so much.
Okay.
Have a wonderful week. We will see you next time on the VC Podcast.
Thanks.